Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody. Pleasure to be with you. I'm going to say hello on camera here for just a moment, just like before. I'll turn my camera off during the course itself so you can all focus on the slides. Thanks again to Ashley. Thanks to everybody at Campbell for putting this on. You guys are always great and very helpful in drawing a big crowd. Nice to see over 300 participants and rising each time I look at it, so that's great. Hopefully many of you or most of you attended last week's class. That one was called Fundamentals of Reserves. If you missed it, that's okay. We do have a recording of that class, so feel free to go back and review that if you find that might be helpful. Today's class is actually going to build on some of the concepts that I introduced last week. So if you didn't attend last week's class, it might be a good idea for you to go back and revisit that. Today's class will also be recorded, so you can always go back and watch the two kind of back to back later on. Today's class is called Reserve Funding Methodologies. Should go for about an hour, and then we'll have that time for Q&A. As Ashley mentioned, try to keep those questions as generic as possible. Without doing a proper reserve study, without knowing too much about any of your communities, it's hard for me to give any very specific answers. And anything that's legal in nature, I really won't be able to comment on. I'm not an attorney, so if you have a question about a legal situation, that's definitely a great opportunity to check with your association's counsel. Let's see, another quick reminder, in the unlikely event of technical difficulties, if I happen to lose the internet, or if I lose power in my building, if you see me freeze up and you can't hear me anymore, please stay in the meeting. I will try to log out and log back in as quickly as I can, hopefully no more than a couple minutes if that happens, but fingers crossed that it doesn't. Let's see, one more reminder for all the CAMs attending today. We will be reporting those course credits to the DBPR within the next couple of days, certainly within the next week. We have not yet uploaded last week's classes. We wanted to do them all kind of in one batch. So if you attended last week and you haven't seen that credit post, that's okay. That's not an error. We're going to do all of them together, and you should see those very soon. So with that, I'll switch off my camera. I'm going to start sharing my screen now, and we will get going here in just a second. Okay, all right. So again, my name is Will Simons. I'll be teaching the course today. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping first. The course is called Reserve Funding Methodologies. This one is approved for 1 hour of continuing education credit in either the Insurance and Financial Management, the IFM section, or as an elective. As Ashley mentioned in her intro, if you didn't register, which I think just by virtue of being in the meeting, you would have registered and you should have provided your CAM license ahead of time. If not, go ahead and email that to her, and that'll get to me, and we'll make sure everybody gets credit. As I say all the time, I don't want to give the impression that this course is only for property managers. If you're a board member out there, a committee member, anybody who has an interest in association budgeting and reserve funding, everybody should get a lot out of this material today. We will be providing copies of the slides. So if there's anything that's very detailed, or you're trying to take notes as you go along and you feel like you missed something, that's okay. We will have that material sent out to everybody as well. Okay, if you attended last week, sorry, this is going to be redundant, but for those that are new to the group, I'll take a moment to introduce myself and our company a little bit more. I'm the president of the Florida office for Association Reserves. I've been with the company since 2008. The RS after my name stands for Reserve Specialist. That's an industry-specific credential that's only awarded to people who have demonstrated their experience and expertise in preparing reserve studies. The designation comes from CAI, the Community Associations Institute. As of now, in our office here in Florida, we've got 5 reserve specialists on staff, including myself, but added together with our other offices throughout the country, we've got several dozen. I believe we have the most reserve specialists of any company in the US. Personally, I've lived in both condos and HOAs. I spent about 6 years serving as the treasurer of my own community in South Florida. We had a budget there of over $1 million, 635 homeowners. And the reason I point that out is because I do know what it's like to be on the other side of the table. Okay, I have worked with the volunteers, with the boards, with the committees, the folks who are taking on the responsibility of running the community. And I'm sure this is true for many of you out there, that your communities might represent hundreds of people, if not thousands, and many millions of dollars worth of property value. Our company is the oldest and largest reserve study provider in the United States. We've been in the business now since 1986, having completed tens of thousands of reserve studies for all different types of properties all around the world. We've got offices from coast to coast, and as I mentioned, more credentialed reserve specialists on staff than any other company. The majority of the work that we do is for community associations, which we know includes all types of condos, HOAs, timeshares, and other residential communities. But we also have a great deal of experience with other types of properties, things like office buildings, hotels, resort properties, worship facilities, and many more. Our only job as a company is preparing reserve studies. Okay, we are not an engineering firm, we're not an accounting firm, but rather a specialized consulting firm which is focused on doing one thing really well, and that is to guide our clients towards a successful financial future. Of course, the way that we do that is by preparing accurate and reliable reserve studies that will help our clients to forecast and budget for major projects. If we do our job well and our clients follow the plans that we help them to design, then hopefully they enjoy a lower risk of special assessments and bank loans and other types of financial distress. If you'd like any additional information, please visit our website. It's right down there in the bottom right of your screen, reservestudy.com, or you can always shoot me an email. My email address is wsimons, WSIMONS, @reservestudy.com. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, as I always do, just giving you a quick outline of what we'll cover today. Just like last week's course, this one also has two sections. The first section is going to talk about the philosophy, the reasoning behind why it's important to have reserves at all. You know, put another way, why is it not okay for an association to just pass a special assessment or go out and get loans every time it needs to take on a big project? Those of you who attended our last class, you'll know that we spent a lot of time going over the concept of percent funded. That's going to be very important to us now as we move into the heart of this course, which is a detailed overview of the two different reserve funding methodologies. There's that title of the course right there. Those are known as the pooled method and the straight line method. Okay, but first, let's begin with the basic question: why have reserves? And to put this in perspective, I'm going to pose this as a hypothetical question. I can't see your hands raised out there, but think to yourself for a moment, what are reserves for? Why do associations collect this money? And really the question is this: is it for the here and now, or is it for the future? So cue the Jeopardy music, think about that for a moment. Okay. Now, most of the time when I ask this question in a live setting, you know, back in the pre-COVID days when we used to do these in front of live groups of people, I would ask everybody to give me a show of hands. You know, how many think reserves are for the here and now, and how many say for the future? And almost all the time, more people would raise their hands to say for the future. But this is a critical point I want to make right off the bat. I want to drive home that reserve funding is for the here and now. Okay. We think it's a misunderstanding to think of reserve funding as saving up for some future project. Okay, now the reason why that's not a great approach is because oftentimes there's a very, very good chance that the current owners, okay, the people who live there in the association today, won't be there at the time some future project takes place. So the argument that makes sense to them is that they don't need to be funding reserves. That's money that's going towards some future project that they won't be around to benefit from. But I would encourage you guys to think of this in a different way. Okay, instead, if you think of reserve funding as paying a current bill, right? It's paying a bill of deterioration that is occurring in the present day. You know, think of it as like a pay-as-you-go model. That's the more appropriate way to categorize this stuff. And let me give you a quick example. Okay, let's say that if I were to buy a unit in a brand new condo building, let's assume that the roof on that building is going to last for 20 years. Now, if I live there for the first 15 years of that building's existence, that means I'm going to enjoy 15 years of use and value out of the roof on that building, not to mention all the other components, right? The mechanical systems, the amenities, and so forth. But let's say I'm going to sell my unit, okay, after those first 15 years, and now some new buyer is going to come in there, and let's say that new buyer is going to live there for the next 15 years. Okay, but remember the timeline. 20-year roof. So only 5 years after they buy my unit, that roof will need to be replaced. Okay, now if I had not been charged accordingly during the time that I lived there, meaning that I was not contributing towards the cost of the roof replacement through ongoing reserve funding, then that new buyer is essentially going to get stuck with the full cost of the replacement project. even though at that point they will have only lived there for 5 years or 25% of the roof's life. They'll still be paying the essential full 20 years worth of its cost, okay? In that scenario, they're paying their share of the life of the roof, but also my share, even though I'm moved away, I'm long gone. Now, you're wondering, so what? Well, if you're the second buyer, okay, and you're deciding between condo buildings that you want to buy into, the fact that my association does not have a healthy reserve fund means that you, as the new buyer, are going to be exposed to more cost and probably a higher chance of a special assessment to make up for the years that I was not being charged for my share of that cost. Okay, in our business, we talk about these 4 sort of reserve rules. The first rule is that expenses are inevitable. Okay, there's just no getting around the fact that air conditioning systems need to be replaced, elevators need to be modernized, roads need to be paved, and so on. Number 2, the board is responsible. Okay, they are the ones entrusted with managing the community association on behalf of all the owners, right? Next up, when projects get delayed, they tend to get more expensive. And we see this kind of thing all the time, especially in the case of roofs, painting and waterproofing, concrete restoration, other types of exterior components. And then the last point on this slide, maybe most importantly, the homeowners will always get stuck paying the bills. Okay, there is no Uncle Sam, there's no government bailout for associations that don't have adequate reserve funding. Okay. Just like there are 4 rules for reserve planning, there are only these 4 options for how to eventually pay those bills, okay? The first and best option, of course, is to have that healthy reserve fund. Now, this may look interesting, but the second best option is to pass special assessments when those projects come along. It should be obvious that, that's a bad situation when the second best option on the table comes with a skull and crossbones warning on it. Now, if you've ever managed or if you've lived in a community that has these recurring special assessments every time something needs to be done, I think you know what I mean by that. It's a toxic thing for a community to go through. Now, the next best option on the table here would be to take out a loan or a line of credit to pay for these projects. But the reason I have that ranked after a special assessment is because, of course, the cost of the project will be greater due to the cost of the financing involved. Now, what happens if you don't do any of those 3? Well, then the property just basically falls into disrepair, right? If you're not paying any money up front out of pocket to take care of it, then when it comes time to sell, you will feel that pain in the form of a decline in property value. Okay, some of the specific benefits of having reserve funds here, starting at the top. First, you shouldn't have any surprises, or at least I would say a lower chance of getting caught by surprise. All right, if you're funding your reserves and you're paying attention, that means you're tracking the remaining life expectancies of all your components, which will give you options to plan ahead and prepare for when they need to be replaced, rather than just reacting and getting caught by surprise when something fails. Okay, when you're planning ahead, that also gives you the chance to shop around, to select from different providers, put a little more time and thought into that scope of work that you're trying to draft. Having that time on your side gives you the ability to seek out more bids. You can try to minimize the cost by working with various contractors. Just as a quick example, you might talk to your painting company and find out, hey, is there a more advantageous time of year for us to do this work? Can we schedule this in advance, maybe even 18 months out, take advantage of maybe a lull in their business. On the flip side, if you're calling out to those same contractors because it's an emergency, right? Your cooling tower just failed, it's a 4th of July weekend, obviously you're reacting to that and you're going to get stuck paying higher fees because it's a rush job. All right. The point here about minimizing exposure, that's mostly relevant to the board members out there. Okay, what I mean by that is that if you're proactively taking care of the property, that means you're doing a better job of upholding your fiduciary duty, which in turn gives you better protection against any potential complaints or any lawsuits that may come your way. And the last point to make on this slide is that if you're doing all of these things, that naturally leads to increasing property values. Okay, in our experience, those communities out there that are doing a good job of reserve funding tend to have better curb appeal. Okay, they're more up to date with respect to technology. They have more modern amenities than the ones that don't. They're constantly reinvesting and reinvigorating the property to stay competitive with the new ones that are constantly being built. Now, all of that hopefully contributes to a better ownership experience for the people who live there, which again, in turn, makes them more attractive to those potential buyers out there. I think that's always a good idea. Think of your building from the perspective of a potential buyer. What are the pros and cons? What are the things that would attract somebody or make them turn away and maybe consider the building down the street? Okay, all the opposites are true if you don't have a healthy reserve fund. That obviously means you're more exposed to surprises. That can lead to higher expenses, more liability exposure, and ultimately, what we all want to avoid, declining property values. And I guess the point to make here is that when we see communities get into this sort of cycle, it becomes more and more difficult to break out of it. All right, so the best thing you can do as a community is to avoid this sort of pattern of behavior. Okay. Just before we jump into this section, a lot of people had questions last time during the Q&A talking about the straight line method versus the pooled method. So, thank you for your patience on that. Last time around, I kind of told everybody, hold off until next week. We're going to cover that in detail. So for the next, 25, 30 minutes or so, I'm going to try to take you through the pros and cons, the differences between these two methods. And hopefully we'll answer most of the questions that you guys had out there. So let's do this. Let's talk about the two ways that associations calculate their reserve funding requirements. First, I'm going to go over the straight line method, and the other term for this method is called the component method. All right, you all know what components are since you hopefully attended last week's class, but if not, I would definitely encourage you to go back and revisit that just to get the terminology. But the reason this is called the component method is because all of those components are treated separately from a funding standpoint, all right? Personally, I think of this as the old-fashioned way, okay? More and more communities are making the switch to the pooled method, which we'll talk about. But part of the reason that this is the old-fashioned way, with air quotes around it, is because prior to 2002, at least in the state of Florida, it was the only approved method, okay? Now, the way that I characterize this one is that it's simple in theory, but when you try to apply it to a complex situation, which, that's what life is, it becomes very troublesome. It gets immediately a lot more complicated. But first, just to kind of help you understand the method, I think it's helpful if you think of each category of reserve components as being handled in these separate buckets, all right? So just visualize something like what we've got here on the screen. For now, let's assume we're talking about these 5 buckets, and we'll call these roof, elevator, painting, mechanical, and pavement, okay? When you're using this method, you determine the amount of funding going into each bucket every year using a simple calculation. Basically, you take the cost of the component that's being funded by that bucket, you subtract out any existing funds that you've already saved for that component, and you divide the remaining difference by the remaining useful life of that component, okay? The result of that calculation will tell you the amount required to quote unquote fully fund that component in the following year's budget. Now, I specifically put air quotes around the term fully fund there, which for reasons that will become clear, let's just say. Okay, but using this this example, let's use the roof reserve or the roof bucket as our first scenario here. Now, if you understand that the total volume of the bucket, okay, the total capacity here represents the total cost to replace the roof. And if you look at your existing reserves as being the current contents of that bucket, the empty portion, the difference here, is something that we might call the unfunded balance. Okay, it's basically just the difference between the total cost of the project minus the money you've already saved up to do it. All right, let's put some real numbers to this. Let's say that the cost of replacing your roof is $200,000. So if you've got $140,000 in your existing roof reserve account, that means you've got an unfunded balance, the difference of $60,000. Okay, so in order for me to determine how much I need to be funding into my roof reserve going forward, I will take my $200,000 replacement cost. I subtract out the $140,000 in existing reserves, existing money that's already there, and I take that difference and divide it by the remaining useful life. Now, let's say we've determined that the remaining life on the roof is 3 years. That means I'll take 200,000 minus 140, which will give me 60,000, meaning that 60,000 divided by 3 equals 20,000. I need to put 20 grand a year into my reserves for the next 3 years in order to fully fund my roof. Now, in order to complete the entire budget, I'm going to repeat that process for each of the remaining buckets. All right, now as this plays out over time, you can see how you might end up with a variety of different funding positions. Depending on how accurate your assumptions were for component life expectancies and costs, some of those accounts may be very well funded while others are not. Now, in our view, this makes for an inefficient distribution of all of the actual reserve cash that association has. In other words, money might be locked up in one account, right, when it would be very advantageous to move it over to some other project that's maybe a higher priority. Now, this is where things start to get kind of complicated. Some of the problems we identify with the straight line method. First of all, it's very often the case that there's been no prior reserve fund established for something important, something like concrete restoration, or the funds might be too broadly defined. For example, we sometimes see one large combined account that maybe is just labeled as mechanical. And in theory, that's supposed to capture everything from security cameras to fire alarms to cooling towers. The problem is that all of those things have very different life expectancies and very different replacement costs. And if you're combining them all into one really broad generic category like that, then you have to start to do some pretty complicated math to figure out the amount of funding required to go into each one, right? Now, from a management standpoint, the component method can be much more of a headache. The reason being is that under this method, the statutes require that the owners have to vote to approve the moving of funds from one place to another. So for example, from your elevator reserve to your parking lot reserve. Now we know, I'm sure you all know, that getting a quorum and passing a vote for anything in a community association is very difficult, especially when it comes to moving money around. Residents are very often skeptical of their boards, right? They're hesitant to give that approval unless they fully understand the situation, which often means that the board and the manager have to call special meetings, send a ton of emails, get the attorneys involved. You know, it becomes kind of this logistical nightmare. Now, lastly, the most serious problem or drawback to this method, I should say, is that because it's more conservative, because associations are not making the most efficient use of the sum of all their available reserve money, that ends up costing the owners in the association more money each year to fund using this method. All right, just to give you an example, at the end of each year, when we look back at all the studies that we've produced as a company, we look at the funding recommendations we've given to those clients, the ones that are using the straight line method, and we compare that against what they could do if they pool their reserves, right? And we want to show them, okay, here's what the difference would be. And last year, what we found, again, with a sample size of hundreds of reserve studies, we found that the average difference between the two methods, between straight line and pooled, was about 200%. Let me say that again. On average, our clients would require triple the amount of funding from the owners if they maintain the straight line method than if they were to pool their reserves. Okay, let's just let that sink in for a moment. Now, given that basically every single association we've ever worked with is trying to cut their costs, lower their assessments, one way that we're able to help them do that is to teach them this concept of pooled reserves. And what we found is that the more and more associations make the switch, they never look back, and the owners benefit forever and ever because it's a more efficient way to do this. Okay, so let's talk about that option. So this is the pooled method, also known as the cash flow method. And this, I think I speak certainly on behalf of our company, but maybe on behalf of the industry in general, that this is the way to go. For a bit of background, this method has only been approved in Florida since 2002. But, again, because we're a national company, we've been around since the mid-'80s. Outside of Florida, this method, the pooled method, is pretty much universally used. Okay, we have 12 offices throughout the United States, and our Florida office is the only one that ever has clients using the straight line method, right? Now, in contrast from the other one, the pooled method, you might say, is a bit more complex in theory, but once you get the hang of it, once you have the right tools to make it work, it's actually much simpler to use for budgeting. Okay, started adding this slide in maybe a year or two ago, because one of the most common questions that I would get when I gave this presentation is, okay, well, all right, well, we like what you're saying, but if we have the straight line method and we're interested in switching to the pooled method, how do we do that? So I added this to kind of talk through that process. Now, I want to be really clear, so pay attention exactly to the sequence here. First and foremost, the board of directors can create a new pooled reserve account all by itself, right? The board can say that, as of this upcoming fiscal year, all of our new incoming reserve money is going to go into a pool of funds. That itself does not require any ownership vote. It's only if the board wants to move money from those old existing straight line accounts into the new pooled fund that the owners would have to vote and approve it. Okay, it's basically the same idea as moving funds from one reserve account to another. It's considered a non-scheduled use of those reserve funds, so the same voting process is required as if you were moving money from, say, your painting reserve to your elevator reserve. The good news here is that this is a one-time process. It's not like you have to take that vote every year when you adopt the budget. Now, last point here is that I would highly recommend you involve your association CPA, your management company, maybe even your attorney to make sure you're going through the process correctly. If you've got a reserve study provider you're working with, you should absolutely want to bring them into the discussion as well. So to kind of go back to the logistics here, the best way that I found to explain this pooled method is to go back to the same bucket analogy that we used when we were talking about straight line. The difference is that only now we're going to take all those separate buckets of money that we talked about in the last few slides and dump them into one big giant bathtub. Okay. Once you do that, you've essentially removed the labels from any specific categories of reserve funds. Instead, now all of the reserve money is collectively available for any component that's on the schedule, that's on the list. In other words, there's no such thing anymore as a roof reserve dollar or a painting reserve dollar or an elevator dollar. It is all just reserve money that can be spent much more effectively, much more efficiently. Okay, now I'm going to go through the process of how you develop your reserve budget when using this method, but it's really important to point out that the first step of the process is exactly the same no matter which method you're using, straight line or pooled. The foundation of any good reserve plan has to be an accurate component list. It does not matter which one you're using if the underlying data is not reliable. Okay, so once you've got your list of reserve components, all of your life expectancies and costs are all dialed in and as accurate as you can make them. Now the idea is to look forward and proceed with a financial analysis. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is design a timeline of expenses. So it might look something like this. Okay, most reserve studies will include something like a 30-year forecast, and the idea here is to show what approximate amounts are going to be spent in any given year. Now, if you look at this chart, these numbers here, these columns represent the combined total amount of reserve spending in any one year. So naturally, there's years when maybe there's no reserve money that needs to be spent, other years when there's very high numbers. Okay, now once you've done that, once you've modeled out the future, and again, that's based on having an understanding of remaining life expectancies and costs, put that all into a spreadsheet, you can accurately figure out when you will spend money and how much. The next logical step is to determine how much money needs to go into the reserve account to meet those future expenses. Now, this is a fairly straightforward process, but I'm going to walk you through the steps. The first thing to do is to determine that sum total of reserve funds at the start of your fiscal year. How much money is in the pool? Now, the next step is then to run some test cases. If you plug in an amount for an estimated contribution to that reserve, which in this case can be a combination of cash from the owners, but also interest earnings. Now, notice that we already have another advantage over straight line, which you can't really model future interest earnings into your assumptions. I think that's another reason to go to the pooled method. But the next step then is to go back to your forecast of expenses, see what your estimated costs look like for that first fiscal year. From there, you're going to do the math. You will take your starting cash position, add in your reserve income, subtract your reserve expenses, and you see where that leaves the balance of the account going into the next year. Now, in year two, you look at the start of that next fiscal year, and you have to make sure that there's still some money in the bank. Okay, if not, then you go back to the first step, right? You need to use a higher contribution rate for that year, because you're never allowed to design a plan that makes you run out of money. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Now, of course, the beauty of doing this process using an Excel spreadsheet or other type of software is that we're able to repeat that process for many years at a time very quickly. Okay, you can model those same expenditures, those same income projections for many years at a time, and it really only takes a few seconds to set up the formulas that would show you how much money you'll be spending over those years, and therefore how much money you need to contribute in all those years in order to keep your account balance at that safe level. Okay, now this leads me to a really important point. There are certainly differences of opinion over what is considered to be a safe level. And basically that breaks down into 3 objectives, what we call baseline funding, full funding, and threshold funding. I'll talk about each one in that order. The first possible objective, okay, now just before we dive into this, remember, this is all in the context of pooled reserves, okay? So when you're using the pooled method and you're talking about baseline funding, this is basically the riskiest option on the table, all right? This is perfectly legal to do, but for most communities, this is a really bad idea. Basically, the objective here, the idea, is that you're figuring out the bare minimum amount of money that you need to put in reserves to keep your account balance, your sum total of the pool of funds, keep that number above 0 throughout the timeline. So whether you're looking out 20 years, 30 years, you're looking at the end of each fiscal year and just solving for some positive number, keep it above 0. Now I'm going to make this next part very clear. When I talk with managers, when I talk with accountants, I get the impression that there's a disconnect in the terminology here. Now, the problem is that if you talk to most people in Florida and you ask them what they mean by fully funding a pooled reserve account, what they will describe to you is what I'm now telling you is baseline funding. It is the minimum required by law unless you get a vote of the owners to approve something less than that. So basically, when we work with our clients, they always want to know, what's the amount of money we need to put into the budget each year so that we don't have to get our owners to vote to approve it. And the law says that that amount, the number that needs to be put in the budget to avoid that vote, is the amount that would be required to keep a positive cash balance in reserves over time. So in this context, anything above 0 is acceptable. This is the actual language that's published in the Florida legislation with respect to pooled funding. Basically says that your contribution rate needs to be enough so that over time, your cash inflows are greater than your cash outflows. But that's it. There's no other requirement to go along with it. But if you take the time to really read the legislation as I have, the term fully funding is not used anywhere with respect to the pooled method. The closest thing that you can find is what they call the term sufficient funds. And in fact, some of you may be familiar with it, but the DBPR has a manual that they've published over the years, which is a guide that's used by managers and board members to explain how to design a pooled funding budget. And in the exact example that they use in that manual, the sample association they're talking about gets to a point where they have $4 in the reserve account, and the state labels that as sufficient funds. Before we do anything else, let me just pose that rhetorical question to you guys out there. Does anybody out there, whether you're a board member, manager, or just somebody who's along for the ride here, does anybody ever think it's a good idea for an association to have $4 in the reserve account? I certainly don't think so. I hope you all recognize that's a very dangerous approach to take. Obviously, if you're just doing that bare minimum, it only takes one problem to completely blow up the plan. That could be a project happening a little bit earlier than you anticipated, costing a little bit more money than you thought. The point is that if you're trying to thread the needle that closely, you have no margin for error. And in that case, the chances you'll need to pass special assessments or go get loans for projects are very, very high. Okay, so if again, one of the main reasons that we're doing this at all, one of the main reasons to fund reserves at all is to prevent special assessments and loans, then I would argue that baseline funding is really not a very responsible strategy. Okay, if you look at this table here, this is a real world example of what baseline funding looks like. Now, if you start at the top left corner of the table here, the first column on the left shows the years, okay, all 30 years of the financial plan from top to bottom. If you move from left to right, okay, you'll see different numbers corresponding to each fiscal year. You've got your starting reserve balance, the fully funded reserve balances as of that year, which we use to calculate percent funded. Now, if I've lost you so far, you need to go back and watch the first class. That's where we go through this concept of percent funded and explain how that's calculated, what the fully funded balance means, and so forth. So if you're not familiar with that concept, highly encourage you to go back and revisit that. But if you're familiar with that now, you know that percent funded is a measurement of risk. Okay, and we can make a determination based on this cash position, this percent funded position, whether that's a low, medium, or high risk place to be. Now, if you again move to the right, the next column here is the reserve contributions for that fiscal year. Okay, we've got a an assumption here if there's any loans or special assessments that are required. In this case, there are none. That's a good thing. And then we show the projected interest income for that year. At the very end, we've got the projected expenses for that first fiscal year, 2022. There are no projected expenses. Okay, so if you've got a nice spreadsheet, then you've got the ability to do some quick math very easily. If you look at the first year here, we'll just focus on 2022, you've got a starting reserve balance of about 1.1 million. Compared against the theoretical fully funded balance for that time, a little over 1.2 million, that would mean that this association is starting at about 89.9, let's just call it 90% funded. And in this case, the next step is to figure out where do they go from here, right? How much of a contribution rate is required to meet the expenses, and assuming our objective is to do baseline funding, to keep the starting reserve balance above zero. So what you see in this plan is that even though they're starting in a strong position, they do have a lot of expenses coming up in the fairly short term, okay? And based on this proposed contribution rate, the $70,500 per year, what you see is that percent funded gradually decreases, okay? It goes from a strong position to a weak position, but all along the account balance stays positive. So in this example, we get to a point about halfway through the timeline where they only have $245 in the bank. Remember, they started with over $1 million. But if you look closely, at that same point in time, they should have $400,000 in the bank. They've just spent a bunch of money, but there's still a need to have cash on hand. So again, percent funded is now dropped to a fraction of a percent, very, very weak position to be. To reiterate a point I made earlier, the state of Florida would still call this sufficient. The owners would not have to vote to approve this. It's only if they wanted to do something even less than that would produce some negative number here, that's when the vote would be required. Okay. We've talked about one end of the spectrum, okay, the minimum requirements when it comes to pooled reserves. Now I'm going to give you the other end of the spectrum, which is the most conservative option, something we call full funding or fully funding the reserves. Now, again, I'm going to be real careful with my terminology here. When I use the term full funding in this context, specifically talking about a pooled reserve account, I'm using a definition that comes from National Reserve Study Standards. As I said before, most people in Florida, if they're, have some experience with budgeting and you ask them about fully funding, they will describe to you what we just talked about, baseline funding. The conflict here, it's a little bit interesting history actually. CAI, I mentioned earlier, Community Associations Institute, they adopted the National Reserve Study Standards back in 1998, a full 4 years prior to when pooled funding became allowable in Florida. Now, I wish I had been in the room when that happened. It would have been nice to be consistent with the existing terminology, but here we are. What I want to make clear is that the definition of full funding we're using here means that you're setting an objective to attain and maintain reserves at or near 100% funded, which is again why it's so important to understand that concept, that measurement tool that we call percent funded. How does that look? Well, let's use the same example as before, but this time we're going to design a plan that will attain and maintain that position of becoming 100% funded. So again, very important to understand the reserve expenses on this far right column. This is the same scenario that I showed you before, same association, same expenses in either case, and same starting point, okay? But now the idea is to determine a funding contribution amount that will not only meet those expenses, but also start to increase this reserve account balance relative to the fully funded balance, maintaining a upward trajectory, right? The goal is to attain and maintain a position of 100% funded. Doesn't mean you have to get there right away. We're not suggesting this community has to go from 90% to 100% overnight. And actually, they will fluctuate. They will bounce around a little bit, but overall, they're gradually increasing up to that ideal position. Another way to look at this comparison here on this chart, okay, you've got percent funded on this left-hand vertical axis here, and we've got time in the 30-year window on the bottom axis there. The different colored dots that you see here represent percent funded based on some different funding plans. Now, again, they all have the same starting point. We're just trying to model the future here. But if you look at the green dots, the top line here, you see that percent funded staying strong the whole time, gradually increasing to that 100% funding level. That is fully funding, okay? The orange dots here, the middle line, represent the baseline plan. Now, if you notice, that actually looks okay for the first 10 years or so, but right up at that point, it falls off a cliff, okay? Now, again, in this plan, we're allowing the association to get as close to zero as possible without ever going below. But the problem is that once they get down that low, it's very hard to recover, right? They started at 90%, even at that level, although they never go below zero, they never regain that strength again, okay? Now, what about the difference in terms of cost, okay? The baseline plan in this example I showed you required $70,500 in contributions, and the full plan required $94,500. In this scenario, that's a difference of about 34%, marginal increase from one to the next, which is actually a more sizable difference than we typically see. Most of the time when we're looking at the difference between baseline funding and full funding, the difference between the dollar amounts is closer to 15 or 20%. But let's put it this way, even at 34% higher, in this specific example, and this, again, this is a real client of ours, the difference only amounted to about $15 per unit per month. So think about that for a second. Less than $1 a day per owner means the difference here between doing the riskiest thing possible and the safest, most responsible thing. Now, keep in mind, the current plan, which this is represented by the purple dots here, that represents what would happen if they just continued on their current path. And we show that really clearly. If they don't increase the reserves at all, then they're absolutely going to bottom out and need some special assessments to climb back up here, okay? So basically, we leave that purple series there just to show to our client, look, you've got to increase your reserve funding no matter what, but while you're at it, why don't you set a target to do the most responsible thing possible? It's only a little bit more money per unit per month, and that will greatly, greatly reduce the risk of special assessments for you in the future. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the last option here. I think it's fairly simple to understand. Basically, threshold funding is any objective between baseline and full funding. Okay, essentially what that means is you pick some target and then you design your funding plan accordingly. So for example, you might say, instead of becoming 100% funded, we just want to do 70%, right? Another way is to say, we want to make sure that we never go below $1 million in our pooled reserve fund. Now, one of the problems with this approach is that it's a lot more subjective. For example, if you have one board in one fiscal year that decides they think the threshold should be 50% funded, and the next year you've got a new board in place and they decide the threshold is better at 20%, that has a big effect on the amount of funding going into the model, based on which objective they're trying to satisfy. Sometimes there's these, unique scenarios that we'll design for a client where we consider their input, but as I talked about on the last slide, it usually just makes more sense to just fully fund, pick 100% funded as your target rather than some arbitrary threshold in the middle. Okay, this will be our last major concept that we'll talk about today. This is one of the most frustrating parts of being a reserve study provider in the state of Florida right now. On the screen in front of you, I've got a paragraph that I copied from the Florida Administrative Code. Now, this is basically the state's official interpretations of what is written in statute. In the section where they talk about pooled reserve funding, they have one sentence at the end which talks about the funding plan not allowing for balloon payments, what I highlighted here in red. Now, I'm sure that when they wrote this sentence, there were good intentions behind it. I think the inspiration behind this was to prevent boards of directors from intentionally kicking the can down the road. But the term that they used in this context, balloon payment, has a very different understanding in most other contexts. Okay, the general understanding of the term balloon payment typically describes a situation where, for example, let's say you've got a mortgage, and for the majority of that mortgage, the borrower pays a certain amount of money each month, and at the very end of the term, they make one single final payment, which is much larger than any of the payments that came before it, right? And let's say it's, it's $1,500 a month for the first 29 years and 11 months of their 30-year term, and then the very, very last payment is a balloon payment of like $50,000. Now, if you put that into association terms, it makes sense that that's not fair. That's not a good way to budget. Basically, they don't want an association to do some small amount of funding for many years, and then at some point in the future, plug in a much higher amount in some particular year when a big project is going to occur. So for example, let's say you've got a townhome community that needs to replace tile roofs. Typically, that'll be the largest expense in their reserve schedule by a great deal. Now, if the project is scheduled 10 years from now, the board that is sitting here today drafting next year's budget might be tempted to say, you know what, we can get away with doing a lower level of funding for the next 9 years if we assume that in year 10, we'll just crank up the reserve contributions in that year where we got to replace the roofs, and that'll be that. What they're essentially doing in that scenario is committing that future group of owners, right, the people who will be there in 10 years, to pick up the tab. They would have to pay that balloon payment, which really probably would be a special assessment at that point. That would allow the owners sitting here today to get by with a lesser amount of funding. And of course, to me, that's not fair. I understand why they would want to put a stop to that. So if you're thinking, well, so what? Okay, here's the problem. Over the last several years, and I've had many conversations with people from the DBPR, the former head of the DBPR, I talked to at a FICPA trade show, hashed out this situation with him and another reserve study provider for a good 30 minutes. And this is what we were told to do. So I'm relaying the message that we were told by the head of the DBPR. Okay, but what we've been told, what we've come to understand in this context, is that the word balloon payment has been interpreted by the DBPR to mean any increase whatsoever in the reserve funding amount. So as an example, if I tell a client this year they need to contribute $100,000 to reserves, and that's based on an analysis using the current replacement costs for all those components and factoring in the remaining life expectancies, that's the right number. Now next year, if we reasonably assume that costs will go up due to inflation, and we want to help keep up with that assumption of inflation, next year, let's say they should contribute $103,000, right? It's gone up by a little bit. And then in year 3, as the costs continue to climb, they should plan to contribute a little bit more, and again and again and again. Normally, I would say that's reasonable, right? Now, the problem that we've run into is that when the state looks at those proposed contribution amounts, they say, no way, you can't have any increases from one year to the next. That's a balloon payment in their terms. Now, our response has been, well, wait a minute. You are allowing us, maybe even encouraging us, to use some assumption of inflation in our reserve studies. That means, of course, the cost of the components that the association is saving up for will be increasing over time. We all agree on that. But now you're telling us that we're not allowed to assume any increase to the contribution rate, okay? That's a major problem, because now, if we all agree that inflation is real and that costs will go up over time, but I'm not allowed to make the same assumption on the other side of the cash flow model, that the contributions to reserves can also increase to meet those rising costs, now all of a sudden it gets a lot more expensive to make that plan work. Okay, in other words, we're allowing the assumption that expenses will go up, but not allowing the assumption that income can go up by the same proportion. Keep in mind, I still need, as a provider, to create a plan that meets some specific criteria. Whether that's baseline or full funding, in either case, it doesn't matter. But to cover those rising expenses, all else being equal, I would have to use a higher contribution rate in the near term of the funding plan to meet my objective, whatever that objective is going to be, which places an unfair burden on the current owners. Okay, in that scenario, if we're assuming inflation, but we're not allowed to assume any increase in the contribution rate, the near-term owners would have to pay more than they should for reserves, right? Because they're basically dealing with inflation in the present day and not over time. So when we complain about this, and I've asked for declaratory statements from the DBPR, we have researched this for a number of years, and every time the response has been, well, just take out inflation, okay? Don't assume that your costs will go up. That should balance things back out. And this is the part, of course, that really gets under my skin. I'm in the business of delivering financial recommendations to my clients, and now I'm being told that one of the key underlying factors that everybody agrees on when you're making a long-term forecast should just be removed. Doesn't feel right. Nobody in their right mind assumes that something that costs $10,000 today will still cost $10,000 15, 20 years from now. I don't think there's any aspect of the economy where that's true. But in order to make these plans work, that's the only logical conclusion. We have to take out inflation, which then allows the funding amount for this initial fiscal year to be more appropriate. Now, what does that mean for you guys, for you managers and board members out there? This is where you come in. The message is that we all need to reinforce to associations that budgeting for reserves is an annual exercise. Okay, you can't just have a reserve study done one year and expect that that same exact document will be useful for 3, 4, 5 years in a row, especially if there's no inflation built into the model. Every single association should be producing a new reserve schedule each year that will always be based on market pricing for components at that time. Now, I'm not trying to sell you on an annual reserve study, although that is an option. But either way, when you're preparing your budgets, the board has to do this. They have to produce a new schedule. That's the only way you can realistically keep on top of these things. In the same way that you have an annual audit done, you should annually be reviewing your reserve assumptions. Okay, that's the bottom line. These are unfortunate and complicated restrictions that we've been asked to work with, but it makes any forecast beyond year one unreliable if you're having to toe the line and not include any inflation. As I mentioned, there are some options here. If you attended last week's class, you'll be familiar with a no site visit update to a reserve study. There's tons of different third-party software apps out there that board members can use at budget time. Now, obviously, this is a fluid situation. This may change. Surely our hope is that one day they'll rewrite this legislation, or at least get rid of this assumption that a balloon payment means what they think it means, and we can go back to being realistic. But until then, it's critical. You guys got to keep in mind that a reserve study has an expiration date. It's only as good as the data that goes into it. Do not let your associations make decisions based on unrealistic information, whether that's provided to you by a third party or something you come up with yourself. As that plays out over time, that will not end well. All right, we're going to go to Q&A here in just a moment, and I already see we've got a lot of questions being asked, so thank you very much. But I want to leave you with a couple parting thoughts, right? So if I've done my job, hopefully you guys agree that reserves are incredibly important for associations in the present and in the future, okay? When you're designing those annual budgets, I want to encourage you to think hard, to choose wisely about which method you use to do so. I don't really pull any punches here. We think the pooled method is by far the best way to do this. And once you've chosen that method, or whatever your method is going to be, make a smart choice about what your long-term objective should be. Okay, baseline funding is not a good strategy. When you're crafting those annual budgets, as I said before in the last class, the goal is never to keep the dues low and keep your members happy. Okay, we're the leaders in this industry, whether you're a reserve study provider, a property manager, or a board member, a volunteer, a committee member, people out there serving your community. It is our collective responsibility to educate the people around us to help them make those wise financial decisions. Okay, all right, let me take a beat here and we will open this up for questions. Ashley, I don't know if you wanted to join me for this part or want me just to start picking over the list, but we can.
Yep, I'm here. Yeah, if you want to start picking at the list, I've been going through anything that was, are you going to send the presentation after, anything like that, I kind of already answered. Yeah, if you want to go through the list, I think that sounds great.
Great. Okay. Now we've got 35 here, 36 and counting. As I said before, I don't know that I'm going to be able to get through all of these, but I will do my best. Okay, I'm just going to go right down from the top. So is pooling reserves better than specific reserve funding? Yes, in my opinion, yes. You know, I think I made a good case for why pooled reserves are advantageous over straight line reserves. Again, I think the most important reason is that it results in a lower out-of-pocket cost to the owners when we're already in a situation where associations are constantly trying to, you know, make it easier on the ownership. One way to do that is to pool your reserves. Okay. All right. Is it possible to have a straight line, but also have one category called general reserves? It's not a good idea. You know, well, there's a couple ways to answer that question. You can have a straight line account or straight line approach where, let's say you have roof reserves, painting reserves, elevator reserves, and those are all specific dedicated amounts for those projects. If in addition to that, you want to have a general category that's for everything else, for your swimming pool, your security cameras, your monument signage, all that kind of stuff, that's possible to do, but you still have to come up with individual life expectancies and costs for all of the things that are specifically meant to be part of that general reserve category. So it doesn't absolve you from the need to do your homework to figure out the calculations required to meet those things. But yes, you can still maintain a straight line reserve account for things that you want to keep restricted for whatever reason. Okay, I've answered some of these other questions, so I'm going to dismiss those as I go along. What basis do you need to include concrete restoration in a reserve study so that the National Reserve Study Standards 4-part test can be met? How do you ascertain the cost and timing of the concrete restoration project if a structural engineer has not prepared an engineering study to determine cost and timing? That's a great question. So I want to make clear, as I have before, that a reserve study is not a substitute for hiring experts in particular fields. You know, if you have an ELSS life safety project, if you have spalling concrete or cracks in columns or rust staining, any indication that there's a structural issue going on, that should be further inspected by a professional in that field. And once you have that, then you can work that information back into your reserve funding plan. If that has not been done, if you're just relying on the reserve study to give you some placeholder numbers, we can do that, right? So, you know, at least speaking for our company, because we've worked with thousands of properties and we see what they're actually spending on concrete restoration work, we feel that reserving for concrete restoration is an appropriate thing to do. We can use, you know, general allowances based on risk factors, right? Does the property have balconies? Does it have balconies and catwalks? Does it have a pool deck with planters? Does it have a subterranean parking garage? You know, we can look at other properties that meet a similar profile and, you know, put in a per unit allowance, usually timed with each painting and waterproofing job, that will give them something. But along with those recommendations, we're constantly saying this is not a substitute for hiring an expert to go out there and do ground penetrating radar or do soundings on all your concrete building facade. That's what really needs to be done to properly diagnose it, but your reserve study can at least be a starting point for going down that path. Let's see, and some of these I'm gonna, you know, maybe skim over because they're maybe a bit too complicated, but I'll do my best here. I've not seen any of these questions before, so bear with me if I take a minute to read them here. When applicable in the presentation, could you please go into more depth than you did previously on how and where to hold funds delegated to hedge against needing a large special assessment or taking out a loan in the event of an insured loss, but needing to cover the huge deductible that large policy amounts have? The windstorm policy deductibles are quite large. Okay, so I think maybe there's two questions in there. One is maybe where to put your reserve money in terms of investments. Unfortunately, those are going to be very limited. Those are going to be CDs, money markets, general savings accounts, really nothing that can put the principal at risk. The whole subject of insurance deductibles in this context, I think, is really something that belongs outside of reserve funding. So what we tell our clients is that you've got your operating account for your routine, you know, daily, weekly, monthly expenses. You've got reserve funds for all the things that meet the 4-part criteria that we talked about in last class. Insurance deductibles are unpredictable. I have no idea when and how often an association will have to pay that deductible. So what we usually recommend is that you consider opening a line of credit, have a separate dedicated emergency fund that could pay that amount in the event that you have to. That can also be for uninsured losses, things like landscaping. But the reason for that, again, is because to properly fund reserves, you have to have a reasonably predictable timeline of remaining life expectancy and cost in order to base a funding calculation. Windstorm deductibles are unpredictable and therefore I think should be considered otherwise. Let's see, given that you've conducted so many reserve studies, do you have any quantitative data that illustrates the accuracy of these studies over time? That's a great question. I've been asked that before. And the short answer is that no, we don't have any quantitative data that illustrates accuracy, only because there's a couple of reasons. One, we often don't know what happens to our client after they do the reserve study, right? Yeah, I don't know if they're going to pass a budget that recommends the funding plan that we put in there. So I don't know that long-term our exact projections would match their reality, because if they don't fund according to the plan, we're kind of not comparing apples to apples anymore. So, you know, that's really the first answer. The second answer is that we've been in business for 35 years and we've done over 50,000 reserve studies. We do know that more than half of our clients come back to us for updates within a short amount of time, usually 3 to 5 years. So my thought is that if we weren't adding value here, and I think I speak on behalf of the reserve study industry in general, we wouldn't exist if we didn't know our stuff. Does that mean we have crystal balls? No, absolutely not. This is an art as much as a science. You know, we try to get our clients in the ballpark, but the accuracy of a reserve study should improve over time as it's updated. As you feed more actual data into the model based on projects you've done, then hopefully that becomes more and more accurate over time. So yeah, I would say anecdotally, we've got a lot of clients that have worked with us many, many times over the years. And I can only surmise that the reason they would do that is because they got some good value out of the estimates we gave them. Okay, what is the acceptable or reasonable number of years to go from no reserve fund to a fully funded fund? Good question. I think, you know, as I showed in the examples there, when we design a fully funding plan, it's over 30 years. Now that can be a different answer for different types of communities based on their risk tolerance, based on their age. So for example, if you've got a brand new building where most of the components are relatively new and not near their expiration date, it might be easier to close that gap going from 0 to 100% within maybe 5 years, 10 years. So it is possible to do it that way. If you've got a much older property where they've historically never had reserves, and to try to go from 0 to 100 is going to be a huge financial burden, we would never suggest that they need to do that right away. It's meant to be a smooth, gradual approach, not a overnight success story going from 0 to 100. But we can certainly design a plan that gets them there faster. You know, the trade-off there is it requires more money to do that. Okay, can the board just arbitrarily change the numbers in the reserve analysis, such as useful life, remaining life, etc.? Technically speaking, a board of directors is responsible for the budget. So by having a reserve study done, that does not make them beholden to following the exact recommendations there. A board can use that information for guidance, but if they disagree with a number, they can design a funding plan that uses their own data. I think anytime you deviate from that, you may open the door to a little bit of reason for concern. You know, it's like if you hire an association attorney to give you legal advice, they give you legal advice and then you do otherwise. First of all, why did you hire them in the first place? And then second of all, are you inviting any liability there? Are you ignoring the advice of experts? Is that a good way to represent your fiduciary duty? So technically speaking, a board can use whatever numbers they want in their proposed reserve budget. The value of hiring an independent company is that it's an objective third party that has no other interest in the building other than providing that guidance. So I think it's better to listen to them. If there's a legitimate complaint, if there's an error in the reserve study, if something is not right in the study, then that should be cause to revise the study, not to totally ignore it or dismiss it. Okay, let's see. Are HOAs as opposed to condos required to have reserves? Have the laws recently changed? For that one, I would suggest you go back and watch the first class. We talk a little bit about the statutory differences between the two. Without going into a long answer, HOAs can have statutory reserves or non-statutory reserves, depending on whether they were initially provided for by the developer or approved by a majority of the voting interests in the community. And if it's one of those two cases, then HOAs function a lot like condos in this regard, but without the same checklist of specific requirements. So for that one, I think you might benefit from the first class. Okay. Can pooled reserve dollars be used for capital projects which have not had a reserve created for it? How would an association do so? That's getting to be a bit complicated. So if you're looking at a capital project that you've never considered as part of a reserve plan before, generally speaking, you should not be using existing reserve money for that new project, because the calculations required to produce that funding in the first place never considered this new addition. So usually when that's the case, I would say that a special assessment might be the right way to go, or if you've got a surplus in your operating account, you also need to consider, is this capital project a once in a lifetime thing, or is it going to be recurring? If it's recurring, then I would say that you might want to add that into your reserve schedule going forward. Okay. I'm not sure I understand this question. What was the 30% if you switch? I'm sorry, I don't know what the context is on that one. Let's see, there was an additional assessment for a roof expecting 1.1 million. The actual cost came in at 750,000 as the lightweight concrete did not need removal. Can the excess be used for concrete restoration in a pooled accounting system? Yes. If your reserves are pooled, there's no such thing as roof reserve dollars versus concrete dollars. It's all reserve money. And that's really the beauty of pooled reserves, is that over time, it's natural. You will have projects that come in high or projects that come in low. And this is what I mean by efficient distribution of your total available cash. Yes, if you have an overage towards one project, you can use it towards a deficit in another. And hopefully as that plays out over time, things normalize and balance each other out. Let's see. Ashley, by the way, let me know if we're running up against any sort of time constraint. I'm going to try to get through as many of these as I can to avoid the deluge of emails that I would otherwise get. So
yep, sounds good. You're good.
All right, here we go. We have two reserve accounts, a general reserve account and a painting reserve account. Should we set up a new general reserve account or use the existing one while we drain the money in the painting account? Let's see here. You can really do either one. I mean, if you can get your owners to vote to pool the reserves, then you just combine them all into one pooled fund. I think that should be plan A. Plan B would be to spend the money out of your existing painting fund. Don't contribute any more money to that painting fund. All new cash should go into the general pooled fund. Yeah, you could really go either way. I think the best approach would be to combine it all, but if not, then you just spend down the old account till that money is depleted, and the next time that project comes along, it's part of the pool. Do you have an Excel sheet formatted that we could use? We do have a great software tool, which is called UPlanet. You can get that through our website. This is free to all of our professional reserve study clients. That is a cloud-based software tool that you can use to model these different funding scenarios, make adjustments to component data, test out different assumptions for interest and inflation. So yeah, we gave out Excel files for a long time with our studies. We've now shifted, as others have, to more of a cloud-based software file. Okay, is a discounted rate used to calculate the percent requirements? I'm not sure if I totally understand that. What I guess the simplest way is all of the percent funded calculations, all of the funding requirements are based on current data. So we're using current replacement costs, we're using the current amount of money that you have on hand, and that is all taken at the present day valuation. So there isn't really a discounted rate of future cash flows or anything like that. Let's see. Okay, please give a rule of thumb or indicators that owners might use to evaluate the robustness of the reserve account using the pooled method to reduce the opportunities of surprises, aka special assessments. I ask this because our 351 unit condo recently had surprise roof and stairway assessments, where obviously roofing stairs on 34-year-old buildings should have been expected and planned for, but were not. I get into detail on that in the first class. We show a kind of a profile where we look at percent funded from 0 to 30% funded being a high risk position, from 30 to 70 to be a fair kind of moderate position. 70% and above is considered a strong position. And I have a table where we look at the correlation of percent funded and special assessment risk. Bottom line is the closer you are to 0, the higher the instances of special assessments. Once you get above 30% funded, I think that risk drops pretty dramatically. So I would say that's, should be kind of the first goal is get out of that weak range and then gradually build towards a strong position. How often should you review the expected cost that is the basis for a particular reserve component? Every year. Every year is the answer. Costs change dramatically. Even in the last few months, we've seen a yo-yo of different building materials. Costs change all the time based on labor rates, based on demand for new construction. So yeah, those are data points that should be reviewed every year. And that can be just as simple as calling contractors that you work with. If you have an elevator company and you want to get a quote for modernization, pick up the phone and give them a call and say, hey, last year we used this. What's the going rate for this project now? And if you do that very consistently, especially for your big ticket items, that's the best way you can make sure that the data is always kept up to date. Okay. Is there a fundamentally different advice or a different methodology that you'd advise for a 34-year-old condo than, say, a 10-year-old condo with respect to pooled funding? No, I would say the methodology, the advice is the same. First of all, pooled funding is good. Second of all, set as your target to be fully funding the reserves. Now, the difference between an old condo and a new condo could be how quickly they get to that level or how painful it might be to get to that level based on the timeline of their expenses. This is akin to, like, I use the analogy all the time, saving for a kid's college fund, right? If you start a college fund for your kid when they're a newborn, it's going to be a lot easier and a lot less painful over time to contribute a little bit of money each month, earn more interest, and build up to that point where you need the funding. If you start it when they're 13, 14 years old, starting high school, you're consolidating that amount of funding into a much shorter time window. So it's going to be a lot more expensive to do it that way. So it doesn't really matter if you're an old building or a new building. It just matters, I guess, or makes a difference as to how quickly you can climb up out of that hole. And oftentimes for older associations, that involves a special assessment just to kind of get back up to a healthy level initially. Let's see, shouldn't you clarify that requirements for reserve funding and or membership approvals for pooling minimum thresholds only apply to HOAs with statutory reserves? Yes, I think I touched on that earlier. If your HOA has statutory reserve funds, you're subject to more specific requirements than if you have non-statutory reserves. If you're unsure which you have, I would ask your accountant or your attorney. They should be able to set you in the right direction. From a reserve funding and reserve study standpoint, we would treat both the same, but there are different legal requirements at budget time that you would have to satisfy. Okay, a common question here. How do you prevent a board from abusing the pooled method? Okay, so that, I was waiting for that question or something like it. Whenever I talk about pooled reserves, sometimes I look at the folks that have their arms crossed and kind of look a bit uncomfortable because they're worried that some rogue runaway board is going to drain all of the reserve money on some pet project, leaving nothing left for anything else. I think there are certainly some stopgaps you can put in place there. First of all, a board that is being reckless in any way is not upholding their fiduciary duty. If you're not upholding that duty, oftentimes not satisfying what they call the business judgment rule, your D&O coverage does not protect you against any poor choices you might make there. So if you have a pooled reserve fund with $1 million in it, and you want to spend $980,000 on remodeling your lobby while the roof is leaking, that's pretty clearly a bad idea, and obviously something that should be complained about, formally or not. And you know, that board should be held accountable for the results of those decisions. The best way you can do this is by involving a team of experts, right? Work with your manager, work with your CPA, work with your attorney, work with your reserve study company, seek out the advice of experts before you're considering these big projects, and they'll help steer you in the right direction. You know, many years ago, I had a client that hired us, and like 3 months prior, they had drained almost all their money on a brand new travertine pool deck. Meanwhile, their elevators had no parts available, they were obsolete, fire alarm system didn't work. So that was a case where, you know, I wish I had talked to them 6 months prior, but I still advocate the pooled method despite, you know, the risk of that happening. I think boards that would abuse that method certainly do so at their own risk. Man, you guys keep asking these questions. Every time I look up, there's more open questions. So I'm going to go for about another 10, 12 minutes before I run out of gas here, and then we'll do
I was just going to say that sounds like a good idea. And in the meantime, I am going to just submit the poll real quick, send it out.
Yeah, give me a breather here.
Take that. That way, if you guys have to jump off, we can get your feedback on how we did. So I just launched that right now, and then Will, if you want to just maybe 10 more minutes. I'm gonna give. There's a lot.
You see what I see, right? They just
I know they keep coming up.
And this is good. This is great. I really appreciate all the engagement and people paying attention. We still have, you know, close to 400 people that are still online with us, so thank you. And apologies if I don't get to your question. We're doing our best here. Let's see, if all of our funding for reserves are kept in one bank account, is that considered a pooled account? Not necessarily. So when you talk about pooled accounting, you would typically have a balance sheet where funds are allocated or dedicated to specific things. Now, it could be that if you have pooled reserves, it is all in one bank account. But not necessarily the case. You can still have straight line reserve funds, and I'm not a CPA, so if a CPA would be willing to correct me on this, I would appreciate that. But my understanding is that you can still have one bank account, but still have straight line reserves. It's just a matter of how you kind of allocate or proportionally divide up that money. On that subject, you definitely want to be mindful of FDIC coverage limits. You know, the FDIC only insures money up to $250,000 in any one bank account. So if you have a reserve fund that has more than that, or reserve funds that add up to be more than that, you do want to make sure they're in separate bank accounts. Are we required to vote on maintaining the reserve fund at each annual meeting of the membership? If so, what is the wording? That's borderline a legal question. So again, not being an attorney, I would advise you to speak with one. But again, the only time that the owners have to vote for anything related to a reserve fund is if the amount of funding proposed would be less than baseline funding. Okay, so in a pooled context, if you're designing your funding plan with that in mind, that you're targeting anything, you know, above zero, but if you want to go less than zero, that's when the owners have to approve that. If you're using the straight line method, it's a simpler process, right? The amount that I showed where you take the cost minus the existing funds and divide by the remaining life, and that gives you one number. There's really no interpretation there. Anything less than that number would require the vote of the owners. So it's a slightly different answer depending on which method you're using, but again, check with your attorney on that. As far as the wording required of how they would go about doing that vote, that's beyond me. Do you recommend using an inflation factor every year? Yes, absolutely. Or at least considering that. You know, not everything inflates every year. Some projects, some components inflate by more than others. But generally speaking, when we look at a long enough time horizon, and I've done this with historical data going back 100 years, if you slice out any 30-year window of time, okay, if you looked at 1920 to 1950 or 1980 to 2010, and if you look at the average annual inflation rate over that period of time, the data shows that it tends to be between 2.5% and 3%. You know, certain years will be very high, certain years are flat. Occasionally things might deflate a little bit, but generally speaking, costs go up every year by a little bit. And so, you know, to keep up with that, I would say just maintain that average inflation number, 2.5% to 3%. You should always be assuming that things will tick up each year a little bit. Now, another way to answer that question is to say, if your budget has remained flat for the last 5 years, 10 years, if your dues have not gone up, that always to me is a red flag situation, because I know that, you know, payroll costs have gone up, insurance costs, utility costs, all the things that are covered on the operating budget, those tend to inflate each year as we, you know, as we would expect. So if your dues have not gone up proportionally, all that means to me is that you're likely cutting from reserves. You're not keeping pace with your reserve funding. So if you're a treasurer, a finance committee chair out there who's tempted to pat yourself on the back for having kept the budget flat, that's not necessarily a good thing. We are partially funded. Is a reserve study really necessary? Well, I'm going to give you a biased answer. Obviously, I do these for a living. I think it's always good to check your numbers. When you say partially funded, I don't know if you mean you're 10% of where you should be or 90% of where you should be. I don't know that you've included everything that you should in your projection. I don't know that you have accurate cost estimates. If you're unsure about any of those details, then I would say it's something to consider. Is there a raw percentage of property value increase for a condo if the association is fully funded? Yes. So we did an example scenario like that a couple years ago, and I talked about this in the last class, that, yeah, we saw a measurable increase. It was about 8% gain when associations were weak versus fair. So the associations between 30 and 70% funded tended to be about 8% more valuable. Associations that were strong funded, you know, above 70%, tended to be almost 13% more valuable. So I go into detail on that on the last class. Would encourage you to check that out. Has the state of Florida eliminated an association's ability to vote to not have a reserve fund? Good question. To my knowledge, no. In the wake of the
All right, well, I think Will has frozen. It's probably because of the thunderstorms. I'm having them also. So, you know, we did answer a bunch of questions. So I guess we'll cut it at that just since Will froze. I will be sending everything out after the course, the recording, the presentation, and then Will's contact information. So if you have any additional questions, you can feel free to follow up via email. I hope you all enjoyed it. And if you can answer that poll, if you didn't, I'm going to leave it open for just a few more minutes, but have a great day.